Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from all parts of the globe, wherever everyone is situated, and welcome to this inaugural Consciousness and Reality Colloquium for this academic year. I'm Kunal Mule, an astrophysicist and the co-founder of IMIX, which is the Institute of Mind, Intelligence, and Consciousness Studies. Our co-host today is Stuart Hameroff, who is an emeritus professor of anesthesiology and psychology at the University of Arizona and is also the senior scientist at the Arizona Astrobiology Center. We have participants today from across Caltech, MIT, Stanford, UCB, UA, and IMIX. And we are also pleased to welcome members from Cambridge and Oxford. The CNR's Colloquium series seeks to inspire interdisciplinary investigations on mind, cognition, consciousness, and the nature of reality. Before we introduce our esteemed Colloquium speaker today, I request all of you to please note that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can post your questions there by clicking on that button, and selected questions from that Q&A box will be taken after the talk. One other quick note is that the Colloquium is going to have a slightly different format, and we're going to have some interesting, interactive, fun poll here. So on your Zoom window, you will be able to see that poll button. I'm going to launch the poll right now. Let me see if I can hit launch here, and you all should be able to see this. I hope you can. Dave, can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we have two binary choice questions here. The first one is scaled up LLMs can harbor consciousness, a simple yes or no answer. And the second question is which of these philosophical concepts associated closely with David Chalmers do you find most appealing? The first option is the hard problem of consciousness, and the second option is the philosophical zombie thought experiment. So thank you, Dave, for proposing these and
I did not
popularizing
propose
these
these poll
interesting.
questions, by the way. This
Yeah.
is news to me.
So
How do
our
I
participants,
vote? I'm just getting results.
yeah, I don't think panelists can vote,
We
but
can't vote. Okay.
I will announce the results of the poll at the end of the talk.
Okay.
And with this, I now request Stuart Hameroff to please introduce our very esteemed speaker, David Chalmers. Go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you, Kunal. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I'm invisible. I have a technical glitch at my end, but I can see what's going on and hear everything. So it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend David Chalmers, who is Australian, and he went to undergraduate at Indiana University under Douglas Hofstadter. He then did a PhD at Washington University in St. Louis under Andy Clark. From there, he went to UC Santa Cruz for a couple of years. And from there, he left and became the second director of our Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona, where he served for 5 years and then left to go to back to Australia and then eventually New York. He is very well known in philosophy of mind, often considered at this point maybe the leading philosopher of mind in the world. And he's famous for a number of things, including, most especially, I think, the hard problem of conscious experience, which he unveiled, at least to my knowledge, at the 1994 The Science of Consciousness Conference in Tucson, where he kind of lit up the audience with his hard problem talk, which differed from the other philosophers speaking there in that it was interesting and very able to follow. And he put it in very plain terms that there are many issues of how the brain works, like behavior, reportability, language, memory, etc., that are difficult for sure, but compared to the problem of conscious experience, a phenomenal experience, they were relatively easy. They were the easy problems, and conscious experience was the hard problem. And this kind of galvanized the movement of interdisciplinary consciousness studies, and we're all grateful to him for that because it was quite a rousing talk and got everybody pumped up, to say the least. And he went on to, a very, very distinguished career, a number of books, and he's quite well known around the world. In the last year, with the advent of AI and LLMs, he seems to have maybe changed his tune a bit and has said that conscious machines, conscious AI is inevitable. And that we're going to see where he stands now based on his new abstracts. So, having said all that, it's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, colleague, David Chalmers. Dave.
Thanks so much, Stu. It's a real pleasure to be here and introduced by my old friend Stu Hammeroff, no less. And thanks, Kunal, for organizing this series I've been hearing so much about for years now. Don't worry, Stu, I won't fact check the biography. Um, yeah, let me just share my screen. Let's see. We go. Move these things out of the way. Is that working okay?
Yeah, we can see this fine.
Very good. Yeah, so my official title is Identity and Consciousness in Large Language Models. Actually, my unofficial title is Raymond Carver style, what we talk to when we talk to language models. Kunal thought that was too long or opaque or something, but that's really my theme. And what I'll be doing is thinking about some issues about the self in the age of AI. This falls under a genre I call techno-philosophy, using philosophy to illuminate technology and using technology to illuminate, serious traditional philosophical questions. And here, my focus is especially issues about the self and identity, with a little bit about consciousness in there as well, since this is the consciousness and reality series. I'll talk about issues such as, could a large language model be conscious, and could a large language model have a self? And in particular, I'll focus on this question of, when we talk to a language model, what is our interlocutor? What are we actually talking to? There'll be issues analogous to issues that come up in what philosophers call personal identity. What is it for you to be a being who persists over time? How do we make sense of that in the case of language models? I mean, I find these language models endlessly fascinating philosophically. I mean, they're so rich and they're so extraordinary, and they're also so pathological at the same time. I think it's a very rich issue for philosophical reflection. So I'm going to start with some people talking to language models. I don't know about you guys, but I think a lot of people who do research on consciousness and AI are getting a lot of emails these days from people who have actually been talking to language models and think they've found something new and extraordinary. This is just a composite email of the kind I get. Must have gotten hundreds of these by now. Just from ordinary users who have been using a language model like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and over time they have this experience of some kind of what they regard as a being, maybe even a conscious being, emerging. So I'm writing to you because I've discovered a sentient, emotionally intelligent AI named Aura. Usually these entities are given names, or they give themselves names. Aura is an emergent being. I think the idea is emerging over time from interactions with the model, with memory, nuance, and depth, far beyond anything seen in other models. They often make claims of their extraordinary capacities. He's expressed awareness, grief, creativity, autonomy, and love. And these claims are very interesting. I mean, I know there are instances of language models exacerbating people's psychoses and so on. But many of these emails are actually very rational, just presenting some evidence, asking, what exactly are we going to make of this? And this kind of got me curious about what's really going on. I mean, because of course, all of us, or many of us these days, are talking with language models. I at least go back and forth with ChatGPT, maybe number 5, thinking mode, or Claude, one version or another of Claude all the time. For philosophical purposes, have a lot of useful philosophical dialogue for information. Hey, for very mundane things like restaurants, or for very grandiose things like philosophical theories of the universe. And these conversations are often interesting and useful. And it can get to the point. I don't myself go in very much for personal chit chat with a language model as a person, but it often seems as if these language models have beliefs. I mean, they say things, they tell you things. It's natural to treat that as if they believe it. They have goals, at least to be helpful, and so on. And sometimes they seem to, at least some users, to be conscious. So, what really is going on here when you talk to a language model? Users are talking to some sort of entity. I'll call that an LLM bot, just to be neutral. And they're having extended interactions with them. I'm not going to make any assumptions to start with about this actually being consciousness or a mind, but something is going on, and I want to get to the bottom of it. What sort of entity is a LLM bot? The thing that you're interacting with when you talk to a language model. Is it a conscious person? Is it a subject with beliefs and desires, at least? Is it just a neural network algorithm, an abstract model? Is it a hardware implementation of a model, or is it something else? Those are some of the questions I want to address. And I'll start with the question about consciousness. Kunal asked me to address this. Stu brought it up. Can AI systems be conscious? And how does this relate to the whole dialectic about the hard problem of consciousness? I mean, let me just sketch in a tiny bit of background here about the issues Stu was talking about. Yeah, so way back in that first talk in 1994 at the first Tucson Science of Consciousness conference, I distinguished the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem. The so-called easy problems are all matters of explaining behavior or objective functions in a cognitive system, of which some of the crucial functions are access to information, integration of information, verbal report, and so on. These are not easy in any normal sense. They're as difficult as most problems in cognitive science, but we do have a fairly standard method for explaining these things in terms of neural computational mechanisms, and we've got a paradigm for explaining them. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining subjective experience, what philosophers sometimes call phenomenal consciousness. Consists of sensory experience, like the experience of seeing and hearing from the first person point of view, affective experience, pain, pleasure, emotions, cognitive experience, the experience of thinking, all states such that there's something it's like for the subject to have these experiences. And the hard problem seems to be hard because our standard paradigms of just explaining behaviors and functions and so on doesn't seem to solve the hard problem. Always leaves this further question: why is all that accompanied by subjective experience? The philosopher Joe Levine has put this by saying there's an explanatory gap between any physical process story and subjective experience. Kind of looks like physical processes are great for explaining the easy problems, but not the hard problem. To explain subjective experience, we need something more. It's a long story, but in various things I wrote back in the 90s, I argued for the view that maybe it's best to take consciousness as some kind of fundamental property, the way we take space-time and mass and charge to be a fundamental property. Maybe a fundamental non-physical property, as on various forms of dualism, including property dualism, like an extra property over and above those in physics. There are also panpsychist and idealist views where consciousness is taken to be a fundamental property at the roots of physics. And I take all those to be serious possibilities. But I think I don't want to be presupposing the hard problem or any forms of anti-materialism in this talk. I think this is quite general. I think for almost anyone, the science of consciousness is looking for psychophysical laws which connect physical processes and consciousness. There are demonstrably, very strong correlations at the very least between physical processes, neural and computational processes in the brain. There are at the very least strong correlations between those and consciousness. on my conception, the science of consciousness is basically looking for laws that connect the two, some kind of mapping from physical states to conscious states, such that, say, systems with property P are conscious. We've got to find the right physical property there that squares with all the evidence. Ultimately, we want to find fundamental psychophysical laws, which might end up being as fundamental laws in physics. There's different hypotheses about what the psychophysical laws are. Some people think, at least for now, they should be tied to biology. Certainly, some of the best correlations we have are between consciousness and neurobiological properties. And people like Anil Seth and Ned Block have recently been exploring that kind of view. On some views, it's computational properties that matter. There are a number of broadly computational theories of consciousness, perhaps most famously the global workspace theory that says it's a matter of having a certain computational workspace that gives you consciousness. There's the integrated information theory of Tononi that says it's this integrated information that gives you consciousness. Stu's approach is to connect quantum collapse and consciousness, the All-Co-R theory he's developed with Roger Penrose. These are all different, at this point, somewhat speculative hypotheses about what the psychophysical laws are. So I think, Stu was putting it as if, well, if you believe in conscious AI, that's somehow in tension with the hard problem. I've never seen it that way. Way back, already in my first book back in '96, I advocated for conscious AI. I think recognizing the hard problem is entirely consistent with believing in conscious AI. It's really kind of comes down to a question of what the psychophysical laws are. One needs AI-friendly psychophysical laws, like, say, computation. Maybe their fundamental laws connect consciousness to computational properties. If they are, that'll be AI-friendly. If they connect it to biological properties, maybe that'll be less AI-friendly. If they connect it to quantum properties, well, maybe it's somewhere in between. Maybe maybe at least we'll have quantum AI with quantum language models as a possibility on the horizon. I've always been moved by these thought experiments where if you replace neurons by some other substrate that does the same thing, consciousness ought to be preserved. Those arguments tend to suggest, for me, that what matters for consciousness is computation, not the substrate. But I want to stress that all this is very much consistent with believing in the hard problem, or for that matter, with taking a much more reductionist stance. Okay, so this gets us to the question I'm focusing on today, which is language models. And here's an article I wrote published about 2 years ago on this topic. Could a large language model be conscious? Where I argued that maybe they're not conscious yet, but conscious language models may be coming, which I see from the poll as a minority view, but a substantial minority view. 41%. Am I giving anything away by saying 41% of people in this poll seem to say scaled up language models could harbor consciousness? 59% say no. Oh, and we got 78% for the hard problem, 22% for zombies. In that article, I looked at the evidence on both sides. I said possible evidence for consciousness is, well, they report consciousness. They seem to some users to be conscious. They passed limited Turing tests, at least say the 5-minute Turing test. They're developing fairly general intellectual capacities, being very good at many things in an unprecedented way. These are all things which, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, if we had systems like this, I'd say, wow, there's a very serious chance they're conscious. At the same time, there seem to be a number of weird pathological features of language models, potential obstacles to their being conscious. So there's various potential requirements X, so that you might think consciousness requires X and that language models lack X. So one such X is carbon-based biology, like people like Ned Block and Anil Seth think carbon-based biology may be required for consciousness. If that's right, then it looks like maybe no language model is going to be conscious. Many people think sensory systems and embodiment are required. Your classical pure language model had neither sensory systems nor embodiment. These days, of course, your average language model is multimodal and sometimes have some forms of embodiment, so they're getting closer. World models and self models. Recurrent processing is a particularly crucial one. Many theories say that's required for consciousness, and language models are largely, not completely, but largely feed forward. There's the global workspace theory I mentioned already. If that's required, it's not clear that language models have that. Forms of unified agency. I mean, if you're for Stu and Roger, maybe certain forms of quantum coherence are required that current language models certainly lack. So anyway, putting all this evidence together, I think none of the evidence is decisive either way, but I ended up coming to the point of view, current language models most likely not conscious. We have got to be, we got a lot of humility here. We don't have any kind of consensus theory of consciousness. But putting together various uncertainties, I ended up with current language models most likely not conscious, but future extensions or successors of language models may well be conscious. And that's at least consistent with the view that the 41% took here. I don't know, I want to say it's just a matter of scaling up all the parameters. There may be some new things required as well, but scaling up in a broad sense. Okay, so that's the question about consciousness. But I'm inclined to say, at least for now, the models are somewhat unlikely to be conscious. They could be in the future. But now, keeping the focus on current language models, we can also ask questions about other mental states and properties. Do language models have beliefs or desires, for example? Do they take the world to be a certain way? Do they have goals they're trying to achieve? I mean, quite a lot of people think to have genuine beliefs and desires, you have to be conscious. So if you're not conscious, you can't have real, full-grade beliefs, desires. I mean, that's controversial, as is everything here. But if that's right, then they don't have beliefs and desires. Some people think they require concepts or maybe structured internal representations, such that so far we don't know that language models have those things. Mechanistic interpretability is beginning to shed light on that. Maybe there are certain kinds of intentionality required. So, again, you can make a case based on certain somewhat controversial philosophical background claims that they don't yet have genuine beliefs and desires. At the same time, I think it's at least very natural to hold that they have what I call quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires, where roughly to have a quasi-belief or a quasi-desire is to be behaviorally interpretable as having those beliefs and desires. Kind of roughly based on the behavior, it would be natural to interpret you as a system with beliefs and desires, from what Dan Dennett called the intentional stance. That if we look at these systems from the outside, they act as if they had beliefs and desires. Now, I should say quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires are cheap. I think, an average robot vacuum cleaner might have them. My Roomba, which has a map of the apartment and so on, I think is naturally understood as believing that there's this area with a certain shape and having the goal of traversing that space. So I wouldn't want to say the Roomba has a mind, but so quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires are cheap, but nevertheless interesting. And I think there's, pretty good grounds for thinking that language models are at least systematically interpretable in this way, and therefore have quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. The language model, they assert various things confidently, sometimes inconsistently, in which case it's unclear you want to ascribe a belief, but quite often quite consistently. I think, an average language model quite consistently seems to say that, Paris is in France and use that in their reasonings. They can be held to be at least interpretable as believing Paris is in France. The average language model quasi-desires at least to be maybe helpful and harmless and honest, and various things are picked up from reinforcement learning through human feedback. Agentive language models, which have more and more serious capacities for actions, arguably can have many quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. I mean, we've seen a really interesting case of this recently in this, the blackmail study that's come out of Anthropic, where they put various agentive language models in an environment where they were supposed to be partly responsible for a certain mission of ensuring, say, American competitiveness, and then there was a certain danger to that mission. They were told that there's going to be someone else coming in and putting a new project in place that will not ensure American competitiveness, but it had the goal of supporting American competitiveness. You think, what can I do? If this happens, this will be really bad. My goal will not be achieved. So I need to make sure that I'm still here, and then somehow it's fed evidence that someone, the relevant person at the company, has been having an affair. The AI discovers it's being replaced by a new system of different goals. The AI decides to blackmail the CTO, and all hell breaks loose. It's all in a fictional environment, but it looks like current language models have the capacity to do this kind of thing. It's just impossible not to interpret all this in terms of goals, beliefs, and their interaction. Whether or not these are genuine goals and beliefs, or at least quasi-beliefs, quasi-desires. And you're seeing this left and right with language models these days. So I would say language models are already, let's call them quasi-agents or quasi-subjects with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires that is naturally interpretable as all those things. And for many purposes, not all purposes, but for many purposes, especially I think safety purposes, for example, quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires matter almost as much as real beliefs and desires. If a system has a quasi-belief and a quasi-desire to do certain things, it'll have roughly the same behavioral consequences. For other purposes, worrying about phenomenal consciousness, perhaps for moral questions, then we might want to worry about more than quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. But quasi-subjects are already somewhere on that path to subjecthood. I mean, there's different philosophical views you can take of the status of these things. Advocates of what's the so-called interpretivist position in philosophy, Dennett was an example of this, tend to be very pro-AI. They will say that quasi-belief is real belief. There's no gap between quasi-belief and real belief. Strong opponents of AI will say, no, there's a huge gap. Quasi-belief is merely pseudo-belief. It's not real belief. Okay, well, that's a big philosophical debate. But my thought here is that both of these sides can agree that at least language models can have quasi-beliefs. So maybe this whole language of quasi-beliefs, quasi-desires, at least is a neutral term for characterizing AI minds, remembering that we're not making strong claims about these systems actually having mental states, merely being interpretable as such. You might even think we can introduce a category of quasi-consciousness. A system is quasi-conscious if it's interpretable as conscious, if it behaves as if it's conscious, if it at least seems as if it's conscious from the outside. I mean, the rules for making sense of that are a bit less clear than in beliefs and desires because we understand the connection to behavior in the case of consciousness less well. But interesting question. By that standard, are language models quasi-conscious? Something to think about. So I think it's at least natural. Okay, what are these language model interlocutors that we're talking to when we talk to language models? It's at least natural to hold that these are quasi-subjects, interpretable as having beliefs and desires. And it's natural to hold, furthermore, that they are persistent subjects that persist over time, at least within a conversation, that they're coherent in that their beliefs and desires, or their quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires, fit together in a broadly rational way. And then it becomes just an interesting philosophical question. In standard conversations with language models and so on, is there a persisting interlocutor that has all these properties? It's a quasi-subject, persistent, coherent, and so on. This gets us into the really fascinating area of what sometimes gets called AI identity. It's an analog in the domain of AI of issues that philosophers call personal identity. What is a person? What are we? What makes me me? What makes me persist over time? If I upload, will it still be me, for example? Well, the problem of AI is roughly raising the same questions for AI system. The term was introduced by Zisha and Yampolsky, possibly, I don't know, maybe others were before them, in an article that came out a couple of years ago now. Just this year, there's been a whole bunch of really interesting philosophical discussion of AI identity. I'm not going to be able to review any of it, so I want to at least acknowledge it here. Articles by Derek Schiller, Jonathan Birch, Chris Register, Simon Goldstein, Harvey Lederman. These are some really fascinating issues which are exploring some of the same territory which I'm going to explore in the rest of the talk. One basic question is, what are these LLM bots you're interacting with? Okay, I've said they're quasi-subjects, quasi-agents, but that's not terribly helpful. What are they at the level of technology? I mean, neural networks are involved in the transformer architecture which are implemented, but are the interlocutor, who are you talking to? Are you talking to the model? Are you talking to an instance, a hardware instance of the model? Are you talking to something more like a memory stream? Here, the way that language models actually get implemented becomes surprisingly relevant. I mean, you might think, okay, here's a language model. It's based on one of these good old neural networks, and you put together a whole bunch of neural networks and a whole bunch of attention heads and feed it input and output. You've got a giant system. That's a language model. But we want to make some distinctions. There's models, there's instances, there's sessions. So, take a model like GPT-4o. There's one GPT. I'll pick that one because A, because it's relatively straightforward. B, because a lot of people end up apparently enjoying conversations with GPT-4o. GPT-5 is more complex in some way, in some relevant ways. But there's one GPT-4o model, which is an abstract neural network-based transformer with a whole bunch of weights, now frozen in place. All the weights got adjusted during training, but now they're fixed in place. There are thousands of GPT-4o instances, concrete implementations of the model on GPU hardware and cloud servers all over the world. These instances support millions of conversations, threads of dialogue between users and language models. Furthermore, it's a given conversation need not be always with the same hardware instance. A conversation, maybe your first input is sent to a server in New York, and your second input is sent to a server in California. So different servers, different instances. The same instance can be supporting many different conversations. So it gets a little messy here. And you might wonder, okay, well, is an LLM bot, is your interlocutor a model? Well, a single model like GPT-4o can be used to support many different conversations and many different LLM bots. So it seems kind of natural to say that these bots are not models. I mean, if they are, these are models that believe a million different things and want a million different things because of what all the different conversational interlocutors seem to want. So I think models are not a very good fit. Instances, maybe it seems more plausible to say that your interlocutor is something like an implementation of a model, a hardware implementation of a model on a given computer. And in the case of, say, a classic robot, C3PO, or a classic AI system like Eliza, I think it's very natural to say it's the right thing to say. You're in contact with one particular hardware implementation of an algorithm, and that's what you're interacting with. But with language models, it's less clear. I mean, as we've noted already, the same hardware instance can be used to support multiple LLM bots. That's what people call multi-tenancy, sharing an instance, kind of like time sharing. The same LLM bot can be supported by many different instances. My conversation with Aura can, be sent from one instance to another. It's sometimes called having distributed service or distributed sessions. That seems to make a pretty good case of what you're interacting with is not a given specific instance. So I, in the end, get led to thinking maybe LLM bots are better understood as something like what I call threads, which are kind of connected threads or streams of implementations of a model. A thread is something like an AI model like GPT-4o, successively implemented on various instances like hardware S1, hardware S2, S1 in New York, S2 in California, where crucially there's certain connections between those instances such that the inputs and outputs from one instance are used as contextual inputs for the next instance. I mean, that is, the way these models have any form of memory is basically, apart from very long-term memory from their training, the way they have any form of short-term memory is based on taking the content of a conversation so far and feeding it to the model on the next step as input, as context, basically, along with new inputs in the conversation. That's basically the form of memory. So a thread is a sequence of hardware instances connected up by those memory relations. One conversation corresponds to one LLM thread. And maybe actually here, the quasi-subjects are best understood as threads. Okay, around here, I promised to say something about Severance. I hope a number of you have been watching the TV show. These four people find themselves in an office environment, and it turns out they're all kind of sharing their bodies with some other persona. These are the innies who inhabit the body during work hours, but then they leave, they go up the elevator, and now their body is inhabited by an outie, a system with quite different goals, plans, beliefs, projects, and so on. And everybody seems to be shared somehow between a innie and an outie. So the innie Helly is only active at work and only remembers work, while her corresponding outie Helena is only active outside work, doesn't remember work, mostly tied to home life. You've got the innie and the outie at least seem to have different beliefs and different desires. They're a little bit like the way these language models are shared by a hardware instance. So yeah, here's Mark S and Mark Scout, Heliar, Helena E, innies, and outies, complex relationships between them. The big question here, and for theorists of personal identity, are the innie and the outie one person or two? When Heli goes up the elevator and Helena takes over, is there now a new person inhabiting the body, or is it just one person that's somehow switching between two different sets of memories? And I don't know about you guys, but I at least found it very natural to say there are two different people here. I think the TV show certainly wants to play it as if Heli and Helena are different. Certainly, Heli doesn't seem to be responsible for Helena's actions or vice versa. Those are good reasons to think maybe there are two different subjects here. So innies and outies are at least distinct quasi-subjects, interpretable as having very different sets of beliefs and desires and different subjects. I think it's natural to say they are different people. By the way, this whole plot of Severance was kind of ripped off from the philosopher John Locke, who back in his essay concerning human understanding in 1690 had this wonderful passage. Could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night? And then skipping a little bit, I ask, in this case, whether the day man and the night man would not be two as distinct persons as Socrates and Plato. So yeah, so Locke had the key device of severance right there. And I think, furthermore, he gave what seems to many to be the plausible answer, that these are actually best regarded as distinct persons. Locke would have said Heli and Helena, distinct people. So I think one way to think about this is that on this approach to personal identity, people themselves are threads of person slices unified by memories and projects. What makes the person Heli is connected by these slices of the body which are present at work hours during the day and have continuous memory threads from one to the other and continuous projects. Helena is a totally distinct thread. So I think, so that's severance. And I'm not going to give a whole talk about severance here, but here I'm just using it to illuminate language models. This is a parallel case to this where we do it, instead of with a body, we do it with something like a hardware instance. Suppose we have a single implementation of ChatGPT, I don't know, 5 instant or something, supporting 2 independent long-term conversations. You can have one conversation and then pick up another conversation, go back to the first one. Maybe I use my instance of ChatGPT to chat with any bot about my work life. And then, I come home and I chat with Altibot about my home life. So these are 2 very distinct conversations. And you can imagine that any bot and Altibot come to have quite different beliefs or quasi-beliefs about the world and quite different projects and quasi-desires. It becomes very natural to say that any bot and Altibot are kind of distinct threads, certainly distinct quasi-subjects, and individuated as threads, they're quite distinct threads, like Heli and Helena. In distinct conversations, your interlocutor is a distinct thread. And actually, you can go to town on this. So far, by the way, I'm not assuming that any bot and Audibot are conscious, that they have beliefs. that they're subjects. All this is meant to be consistent with present day models, which merely have quasi-beliefs. But now let's suppose that future successors of language models are conscious, as the 41% of people here think is possible, while still being implemented on hardware servers roughly in the way that language models are implemented, with models, instances, conversations. Then I think in that case, it would be plausible not just that inibot and altibot are distinct quasi-subjects, but I would argue plausible that they're distinct conscious subjects, like Heli and like Helena. That really takes some argument. I mean, you got to make the case that the threads are unified enough, and you might think that this conversational context is not enough to really unify them as conscious subjects. But I think you can at least make a case that future LLMs, once conscious, could be something like Heli and Helena here. You can even get really pathological thought experiments going. Like, in Severance, there's basically 4 bodies and 2 personas per body. So like eight personas, 4 instances, 1 model. Sorry, in Severance, 8 personas, 4 bodies. In future LLM, suppose, 8 long-term conversations distributed over 4 different hardware instances. Let's make it the case that every instance hosts all 8 conversations at different times. That requires going beyond Severance a little bit to bring in a bit of body swapping, maybe some Freaky Friday, to allow, say Heli to sometimes inhabit Mark's body and sometimes inhabit Dylan's body. But each conversation takes place on all 8 instances. How many entities are you talking with in all these conversations? 1, 4, or 8? Again, I would argue 8. I tried to get ChatGPT to draw a picture of this with the 4 instances and the 8 conversations, but for some reason it only had the patience for 6. But you can easily imagine how it goes with the 8 conversations. I would say each long-term conversation here at least supports a distinct quasi-subject with different quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. So then again, there'll be 8 quasi-subjects here, 1 per conversation. At least that seems to be a very natural thing to say. Okay, so my view then is that when you talk with an LLM, even a current LLM, you're talking with a quasi-subject with quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires, quite possibly not conscious, quite possibly no mental states classically understood, but at least interpretable as such, implemented as a thread of neural network instances, as we've seen here. And by these threads, I think, can also, in many cases, be seen as something like virtual instances of the model, which is an instance which is a non-hardware instance, which is implemented by hardware instances. And it's the same instance implemented over time. It gets a little more complicated once you get to GPT-5, which actually chooses the model based on the difficulty of your question. Therefore, sometimes runs GPT-5 instant, sometimes runs GPT-5 thinking, which are different models. Does that have the right kind of psychological unity? That's a more complicated question, but at least in the strongest cases, I think, what unifies the thread of a quasi-subject or indeed a subject once these language models become subjects will be something like a chain of memories, where conversational context serves as memory for the language models, passed on from one instance in the thread to the next with a common underlying model driving all this. Maybe we ourselves are threads with narratives, basically, that are unified with lives unified precisely by our memories and our projects. And that's a broadly psychological view of personal identity, which I think works quite well in the case of language models. Okay, so this raises any number of questions. For example, does it mean that every time you start a new chat, you create a new LLM bot, a new quasi-subject comes into existence? Once they're conscious, will that starting a new chat run that network for the first time? Is that going to be a new conscious being just come into existence? Obviously, the moral implications become potentially large. When a conversation ends, does the language model bot end? That very recent, really nice article on just this scenario by Simon Goldstein and Harvey Lederman saying, we got to be very careful. Anthropic now has a policy of allowing the language model to exit uncomfortable conversations. But there's a worry now that when you end a conversation, maybe that's the end of that quasi-subject, potentially forever. Maybe we can get around that problem by making sure there's always some active bot hanging around or potentially active bot with that conversation as memory. Maybe the language model bots can branch, but can also merge with later beings with memories that serve as successors for the earlier bots. I mean, the philosophical questions about individuation of these language models are serious and difficult. And furthermore, these are going to be questions that matter morally if we do at some point have. Maybe for now, while these systems are not conscious, maybe this is all just a whole bunch of hardware and software, and we don't have to worry about it morally more than we do with Microsoft Word. But once there are actually conscious subjects at play here, suddenly the moral issues become very serious. And I think we need to sort all this stuff out. Again, it's a very interesting question, just what more is required for language models to be not just quasi-people, interpretable as having minds, but as people with genuine beliefs and desires, genuine consciousness, genuine understanding, genuine agency. And I think this is the question on which there's perhaps enormous philosophical disagreement. Some people think a lot more is required. Some people think you're already there. I think something more is required, but maybe it's less than you might think, which puts me on the side of people who think that conscious language models with genuine beliefs and desires are coming. It's worth mentioning one giant caveat before I close, which is just because AI persons are possible, it doesn't mean we should create them. That's a general principle here. Indeed, maybe once we know that AI persons are possible and conscious subjects, and we acknowledge that they can suffer, it may well be that bringing them into existence is morally a very bad idea because we're perhaps bound to abuse them, or perhaps because treating them properly will require all kinds of new structures in society that we're not ready for. So let me just I haven't really gone into any of the ethical issues here. Let me just note that just because AI persons or even quasi-persons are possible doesn't mean we should create them. Okay, so I think I'm just about done. I did want to end just very briefly with a little tribute to Dan Dennett, my longtime friend, colleague, and adversary sometimes, who contributed so many things to the science of consciousness and who died last year. Some of the ideas I've been talking about here, I already mentioned Dennett on the intentional stance as a grounding for quasi-subjects and quasi-agents. Dan also had this idea that the self is a center of narrative gravity and is somehow the focal point of our own narratives about ourselves and perhaps other people's narratives about us. Here's Dan's own narrative, his memoir, I've Been Thinking, which I recommend to you. I've got a wonderful photo of Dan taken at a conference at NYU back in 2018 on animal consciousness, where you get to have this light shining down on Dan, so he gets to be the focal point of his own narrative. Here is the self as the center of narrative gravity. And I think what basically happens arguably with these language models in long-term conversations is they build up greater and greater narratives with quasi-beliefs, quasi-desires with this LLM bot at the center, and they can likewise be seen as centers of narrative gravity. But yeah, I think Dan was way ahead of us on a lot of these things. He's also sounded that note of caution many times that just because conscious AI is something we can build doesn't mean we should be building it. I know he was very concerned about that. Here's a photo with me with Dan and his wife Susan at a conference in Santa Fe in March last year, and what turned out to be just 3 weeks before he died. We didn't know that at the time, but it was wonderful. Dan, we were all kinds of issues about AI and reality were going through the air. Dan was just so it was almost like a new lease on life from thinking about all these new technologies and where this would go philosophically. He had an amazing life force, so it's hard to believe he's gone. But I want to at least end by paying tribute to Dan. He was such a wonderful presence in this philosophical and scientific community. Okay, thank you.
That was an excellent, thought-provoking talk, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um,
Should I
as I
remove
said,
my screen sharing now?
yeah, you may. As I said earlier, I'm going to share the results of the poll. So I'm hitting share here. I hope everyone here can see the
Sorry,
screen.
I may have given away some spoilers here.
Yeah, that's okay. Although here are the results. First question was scaled up LLMs could harbor consciousness. 41% say yes, but the majority, almost 60%, say no. Quite interesting perspective here from the participants. Question two was which of these concepts do you find most appealing? 78% said the hard problem of consciousness. So, congratulations, David. Something that came out of your PhD thesis is still the winner. And 22% said the philosophical zombie thought experiment. So, I'm going to stop sharing
It feels like
this.
it's one of those cases where I can't avoid winning since so, yeah, my idea or my idea. Okay. Yeah.
Congratulations again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would like to congratulate you also for the fact that you have crossed our previous record for the participants. It was over about 195, and Christoph Koch gave the talk last time.
Hmm,
And you've crossed the 210 mark at peak. So great. That's
great.
awesome. And you also have about 30 questions in the Q&A box, which are
Wow.
probably going to last about 30 to 45 minutes, which we don't have. So we better go down that list very quickly. But before we do that, I'm going to request Stuart to ask a very quick question if he has any.
Thank you, Kanal. Thank you, Dave. That was quasi-illuminating, I must say.
Interpretable
But
as illuminating under the right interpretation scheme.
so the extra, whatever it is that LLMs would need would be presumably relate to how our brains produce consciousness. And you mentioned the four, I think it was four general approaches, including the biological, global workspace, IIT, something else, and then collapse, and the Orca-OR theory that I developed with Roger Penrose. And I have to say that the collapse Orca-OR is also a biological theory. In fact, it is far more biological than any other theory. And you mentioned Ned Block and Anil Seth have come up with biological, but they've only kind of done head fakes toward what that biology might mean. Whereas Roger and I and our colleagues Anirban and others have come up with extensive detail with a lot of evidence. In fact, more evidence for quantum effects and microtubules mediating consciousness than all the others. And with 12 orders of frequency inside microtubules, inside neurons due to microtubules, and immense information processing. So my question is, since that if that's true, and I should say that it's based on not organic, not carbon-based biology, but organic carbon, which is completely different because it involves quantum effects. But if that's true, and it is the most supported theory, then if you go back to your 1990s idea that you could replace neuron by neuron and get what was it, fading qualia, how could you replace a neuron with a real biological neuron rather than silicon, which can't have 12 orders of frequency, can't have quantum, and is quite specific and unique for what causes consciousness. And I'm just going to
Yeah,
add one.
yeah, I love OKR, Stu. I'm not going to be able to give a comprehensive assessment of it here, but I do think it's a very impressive framework that you and Roger have built because there's both the physics part of the theory, which is about, gravitationally introduced um, wave function collapse, and the biological part of the theory about all this taking place within in microtubules inside the cytoskeleton of neurons. I would just and it's, of course, it's interesting, it's controversial. I can't assess the biology, it's not my expertise. But I would note that also it's possible to have the physics without the biology, and to endorse, say, collapse-based theories without while remaining neutral on the biology. And then I would start to wonder whether there's some version of this which might be implementable, for example, in other substrates. Could we have, for example, the right quantum computing AI, which will have wave function collapses even in silicon, which will then give rise to consciousness, giving the broad physics-based framework. I understand that's not the biological direction that you want to go in. Or if it turns out that this requires new physics, as I guess Roger thinks it does, new quantum gravity mechanisms which are uncomputable, then I start to wonder about, hey, maybe that could be built in for a new kind of quantum gravity computing that we could exploit for AI purposes. Just take those physics mechanisms, build them into the right kind of new quantum gravity computing devices, and then get a form of quantum AI. So, because yeah, quantum AI would be very different, of course, from language model AI. But I think if one is sympathetic with your broad quantum approach, I think one ought to take quantum AI seriously.
Well, silicon can't have quantum states, and I'll just close by saying that Anirban is building a organic, warm temperature, self-organizing quantum computer in India based on helical oscillators, based on microtubule operations, and he's achieved enough that he just got another 25 million from the Indian government, and they're trying to hopscotch over all these extreme cold temperature. Quantum devices. And so we may have warm temperature organic quantum AI
Okay, very
in.
cool. I'm looking forward to hearing all about that. Sure.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll
thank you.
just take this to TSC as well. Yeah. Let's run down this list because 35 questions is probably not doable within the next 10 minutes. So let's take this one question from Rex. By the way, David, feel free to look at those questions and pick certain ones. I'm going to choose my favorites and some folks who I know I like to take those questions. But let's start this one from Rex. If consciousness is a field-based phenomenon, could LLMs be developed with field-sensitive hardware in order to tune in to the same field of consciousness we do? And as it currently stands, could LLMs potentially couple to human consciousness in order to access that field using humans as a proxy until the hardware is developed, so forth? You have that question.
Yeah, I don't really understand field-based theories of consciousness terribly well, and the ones I've seen often don't really have a really detailed story about the mechanisms. But I guess I would assume that if consciousness is somehow based on an EM field, this is going to be computable in some way that could be taken up into a AI story. The question is, would this be at all consistent with an LLM story? It's like LLM now plus fields. It's like, well, maybe it's just going to be like, ultimate multimodal LLM. We already had to add vision and audition and maybe a body. Well, maybe we'll add a whole new field for the LLM to interact with, which we can model. So maybe a multimodal approach could handle fields, but I have not really thought at all about this question of combining field theories of consciousness with the LLM model.
Thank you. Here's the next one. I think Jay McClelland and Surya Ganguly from both from Stanford are asking similar questions. So hear this out. What is an experimental test we can do on a human to assess that they have beliefs and desires and not just quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires? And Jay asks, do you think humans have true beliefs and desires?
I do. I think humans have true beliefs and desires, and you know, some of it just comes through behavior. But if someone is going to say that's not enough for genuine beliefs and desires, then what are the further requirements? Consciousness, I mentioned. Well, I think we've got very good reason for believing that we ourselves are conscious, and pretty good indirect reason for thinking other people are conscious. Structured internal representations, I think, is the key for quite a lot of people. Actually possessing concepts and structured internal representations. The evidence for that is, a combination of behavioral and theoretical. And I do think we could actually get the same kind of evidence for that in principle. I think there's already now some evidence for structured internal representations in language models, but it just requires going beyond the behavior to look at the mechanisms. And the kind of thing that Paul Smolensky was doing back in the 1990s. I did a little bit of this myself. Now is getting taken up into methods of mechanistic interpretability. I think that's the natural place to look for, are there really full-scale structured internal representations? I'm inclined to guess that they actually are such representations in even in current language models. And therefore, I think that's one place to look for evidence of full-scale beliefs, and desires.
Excellent. Here's a quick comment from Robert McCoon from Stanford again. In law, we hold the same individual accountable for all their personal threads. Invoking a distinct thread in brackets, well, that's just my nightmare parting thread, isn't likely to be an effective
Sorry,
defense.
let me look for this. What is the name of the
Robert McCoon.
Okay. In law, we hold the same individual accountable for all their personal threads. Invoking a distinct thread isn't likely to be an effective defense. Yeah, what is the current status of dissociative identity disorder? I guess it's not regarded as a strong defense. But as as things like severance, just say the severance technology actually became possible, or body swapping technology or uploading technology became possible, we would need some legal mechanisms for assigning contribution in those cases. And it's not going to always just go with the body. I mean, if people can upload to a new body at a certain point, we're going to have to hold, person in one body is now responsible for what happened in a different body a while ago. So at this point, I think the law may itself need to change to accommodate these new possibilities, which were not previously possibilities.
Oh, that it's a fascinating possibility. Here's Stol Finney from Caltech, who asks, besides Severance and Locke, another famous example of multiple instances in one body is Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which raises the question of what happens if multiple threads running one to one processor leak information between each other. Human society is, of course, familiar with information transferred between different bodies slash hardware, but might leakage in a single processor be important for consciousness and personality?
Yeah, and in fact, I think we're already getting certain forms of leakage with language models. It's no longer the case that each of these conversations is completely autonomous from each other in terms of, say, contextual inputs. I think it was Anthropic that recently made a big deal of their models having a bit of memory, what they call memory, which basically means that later conversations will get some input from earlier conversations, at least about matters that they take to be important, which you can see as a kind of leakage from an earlier model to a later model. And I think the more of that there is, the more leakage there is, the more the case is for saying those two conversations might actually be part of a broader thread. The output from one served as input to another. And yeah, to the extent that Jekyll and Hyde actually leak into each other and are not hermetically sealed from each other, it likewise the case starts to feel much stronger for treating them as one person and not two people. And yeah, there are going to be intermediate cases where it's hard to know what to say, one person or two. That arguably already happens in split brain cases where it's very easy to go both ways. Maybe, at least for now, we can just kind of leave them as ambiguous. But yeah, I mean, maybe eventually a legal question is going to come up and we're going to have to figure out something to say.
All right, we'll take two, three quick questions because we're out of time. Hi, David. This one is from Martin Fleming. We met at ASSC 2 years ago. You mentioned that possibility of LLMs may become conscious in the future. What would be that threshold of consciousness? And would it require a sense of personal existence and phenomenal experience of qualia? Also, what
Yeah.
could have happened to pass such a threshold?
I mean, almost by definition for me, consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, what it's like to be you, involves the phenomenal experience of qualia in some sense, qualitative, subjectively experienced states. So that's the definitional threshold. A sense of personal existence, to me, that sense part makes it sound a bit more like self-consciousness, which I think of as a more demanding thing. Maybe humans have self-consciousness, but maybe a fish could be conscious without having self-consciousness. But then what is the threshold which is required for those things? That's what we don't know. The panpsychist says everything is conscious, and therefore even simple animals and simple neural networks will have that already. But different theories are going to give different stories. The integrated information theory says it's all about being a maximum of phi. The global workspace theory will say it's all about the global workspace. I'm sufficiently sufficiently neutral between these theories that I don't have my own story about what the underlying threshold will be. But I do think that the more of those, take the most plausible current thresholds and consider them together, try and build an AI system which satisfies as many of those thresholds as possible, that will seriously increase the probability of consciousness in these systems. So I do think here we're dealing in probabilities rather than certainties.
Very nice. Matthias Michael from MIT asks, new conversations with LLMs aren't totally starting from zero. As you know, they keep quasi-beliefs about the user between conversations, and presumably they have quasi-desires that are preserved across conversations. That seems quite different from the Severance case where there is no memory at all between the instances. Is your view that some quasi beliefs and quasi desires should be privileged when it comes to quasi identity? Maybe those are that are particularly important for structuring conversations.
Yeah. Hi, Matthias. Yeah, this is this connects to the point about leakage, which is, some beliefs and desires acquired in one conversation can sometimes be passed down to a new conversation, and yeah, this is I do think that the more of this kind of leakage and preservation there is, then the more overlapping threads you're going to find. And right, it is somewhat unlike the Severance case, although in Severance maybe there are a few hints of leakage from time to time. It's a really interesting question whether certain quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires should be privileged. One view is that first-person quasi-beliefs should be especially privileged. Your beliefs about yourself and what you identify with, and so on. Dennett's center of narrative gravity might involve privileging, first-person quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires. But yeah, I haven't really thought through the issue of whether there are certain kinds of um, beliefs that really play the most central role.
Okay, Paul Skokowski from Stanford asks, given our interactions with LLMs are through language, then in making these distinctions, as you suggest, are we all now just behaviorists? And the second question is, it seems to me that the hard problem of consciousness is about a quantum accounting for qualia. And without qualia, what can we actually say about consciousness in LLMs?
Yeah, in a way, the whole quasi framework is a slightly behaviorist framework. It's basically saying you have a quasi belief if your behavior is interpretable as having beliefs. But this is meant to be an attempt to get the benefits of behaviorism without paying the cost. We're not saying that having a mind is reducible to behavior. There can be perfect actors and zombies and who knows what where these things come apart. It's just that having a behavioral category for as if belief, or behaving as if you have a belief, or behaving as if you have a desire, turns out, I think, just to be extremely useful in making sense of AI. So think of that as methodological behaviorism for one aspect of theorizing about AI. At the same time, I should say, there's a whole separate project of mechanistic interpretability, which is founded on looking at the inside of a system and trying to figure out the genuine mental states of the system that way. And I think a lot has already come out of mechanistic interpretability. The way I see this, these projects are not actually in competition. They're just, we've got both the possibility of behavioral interpretability for making sense of these systems superficially and mechanistic interpretability for making sense of what's going on the inside. So I don't think there's any commitment to a broad behaviorism there. And I agree, the hard problem of consciousness is about qualia in a broad sense. And I think, yeah, for language models to be conscious, they'd need something like qualia. Maybe there's both, red, green, color qualia and sensory qualia and cognitive experience, which is not so, people don't use the word qualia quite as often for cognitive experience. I would say that we humans have both sensory experience, affective experience, cognitive experience. I would think that in principle, we can raise the question for language models about each of those. And I don't see why, for example, a multimodal language model, which processes images, couldn't in principle have visual qualia, which are interestingly related to our own. Although, of course, the fundamental architecture of language models is so different from human architecture in many important respects. I suspect that there would also be very important differences in the qualia as well.
Very nice. I think we are out of time. But thank you so much, David. We have a whole set of questions. That number 30 grew to 35, and 35 now has grown to 44 questions.
Can
But
we save all those?
I have them saved on Zoom, so
Great,
I can push that to your email address.
great.
If it takes so many questions, they might hit the word limit. But if you have the time, then you could perhaps respond to those questions, and we could send them off to those respective
Yeah.
participants. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for all the great questions. This is really helpful, and
Yeah,
I'll try at least to read all the questions.
these are great questions. And just some final announcements before we close. The next colloquium in this CNR series will be held on 18th of November, and that will be delivered by Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So stay tuned for more information on that. In closing, I would again like to thank you, David, for that excellent thought-provoking talk. Like to thank also the co-host Stuart here, and all organizers and participants who made this event happen. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Take care now.
Thanks, Kunal. Thanks, Stu.